Hello friends, welcome back to this lecture number 5 of the course on human behavior. So, this lecture will be focused on something called perception. And so, what I will do is, as I have been following in the last 4 lectures, I will start with a little recap of what we did in the earlier classes, and then we will get on with the business of making you understand what perception is. For starters, let me start by a definition of what perception is. So, perception is making meaning of the external stimuli which the sensory organs are grabbing and sending to the brain. That is what perception is. So, what the sense organs actually see are colors or light which is reflected from some object. So, at the best the sense organs can detect this and tell the brain that they can see colors, they can see form, and they can see objects foreground and background. It is the job of the brain to collect these informations about angles, about lines, about foreground and background, about colors, about brightness and darkness, and based on that comprising these informations and making the meaning that is a tree, something is a tree and something is a person. So, perception is that function of the brain which integrates information from sensation to make a meaning. But before we jump into what perception is, let us go back a little and see what we did in the last 4 lectures. We started off by telling why do we need this course, how do we study human behavior, and explaining what is human behavior, what is the need of study of human behavior. So, we started off by telling that human behavior is necessary because in all situations we are humans and we want to study humans. So, the only science or the science which actually helps us understand human behavior is psychology. So, this course is more about psychology. Why do we need to study human behavior? Well, the answer is because everybody wants to study what other people would react to, how other people react to, what they do, why they do, when they do, and things like that. At the core of all this function is the idea that people want to control, and that is the one power that people want. If you can control other people, it would be a nice world. So, you can control inanimate objects, but you cannot control human beings. And so, that is the idea why should we studying human behavior. And the other important thing being that humans are unpredictable. And so, using a science of psychology, we can study what people do and how they do. And when we can predict what they do and how they do, we can have a better grip of the situation and can have much meaningful interactions with them. So, we started off there by starting up and giving up definitions of what psychology is and what does it do and how it does it. Then we went on to look at a little bit of history of how psychology started, and there we pointed out that psychology started from 2 branches, one with philosophy and the other is physiology, and how these 2 branches combined together to actually form the science of psychology. Then we moved on to explaining some basic questions in psychology, which is the nature nurture debate and some other basic debates that we did there. Further to that, we explained some schools of psychology. So, we started off by looking at the schools of structuralism, functionalism, gestaltism, psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So, what are these schools actually? So, when we talk about structuralism, it talks about human behavior in terms of basic structures. So, human behaviors can be broken down into basic structures. The reason why this school was proposed was people who proposed this school, they came from basic sciences of physics and physiology, and they wanted to study human behavior as they would study atoms and molecules. And so, human behavior they believed can be broken down into its parts and can be studied. Contrary to this view was the view of functionalism, where human behavior was explained in terms of adaptiveness of a behavior. So, how do you study human behavior? You can only see a human behavior or study human behavior when it is actually going on, and so you cannot be breaking that into parts. Then came the idea of behaviorism, which says that if you want to study human behavior, you have to see how many times a particular stimulus gives a particular response, how human beings respond to certain situations, and if you can do that for n number of time, you will come up with an optimal response and thus make a prediction that if a particular stimulus appears, human beings will do a particular kind of a response. For example, if somebody kicks you, you will become angry is a relational thing. It has nothing to do with mind, brain, soul and those kind of things. So, it is a simple stimulus response function. Then came the idea of Gestalt school, which actually talked about that human behavior is not about looking at behavior as part and whole. So, if you want to study human behavior, you have to study human behavior as wholes and parts, which basically means that a single behavior and parts of the behavior cannot be combined into one. Also, human behaviors could be studied in terms of organization principles that they proposed. And lastly, we had the psychoanalysis school, which said that most behavior comes from unconscious urges that people have. Further to that, we looked at some newer schools of psychology or newer approaches to psychology, and these were the psycholinguistics, the neuropsychology, the idea about cognitive neuroscience, and so on and so forth. And that was the end of the first lecture, and so in continuation to that we had the second lecture, where we actually looked at some viewpoints from which a human behavior could be studied. So, a particular human behavior can be studied from a number of viewpoints, starting from the behavioral viewpoint to the cognitive viewpoint to the subjective viewpoint to the psychoanalytical viewpoint, and so on and so forth. And that is what we did in that lecture. Further to that, we expanded our study there, or we expanded our lecture there, and I explained to you how do we do research in human behavior, in human psychology, and that I explained in terms of something called experimentation, something called correlational research, literature reviews, in terms of observations, and in terms of modeling, and a number of other ways of doing research in human or research on humans. The last two lectures were focused on sensation, where we looked at how the physical world and the psychological world interact with each other. In the physical world, we have things which are physical in nature. For example, we have temperature, we have pressure, we have light photons, we have air pressure which is creating the audition, and so on and so forth. So, how these objects or how these elements actually get converted into something which humans can read, and that was the topic of the last the third lecture. So, the third lecture we looked at how the sensory organs take these physical information and convert it into something which the brain can study and make meaning out of it. We started off by looking at what are the problems which any sensory organs would face, and then we looked at the characteristics of any sense organs, and there we defined two factors. One is called sensitivity and the other is called sensory coding. Sensitivity is how accurate your sensory system is or any detection system is, and we looked at two basic parameters of any sensitivity of a system, which is the absolute threshold and the differential threshold. Further to that, we looked at how errors are marked in these sensory systems using a theory of signal detection. Then we focused on to something called sensory coding, which is how the biological functions or how the biological system encodes the sensory information which is passed on from the sensory systems. We also looked at how complexity and intensity of a physical stimulus is encoded by the sensory system. Further to that, we took a model sensory organ, which is the eye, and then dissected it to look at how does the eye create vision, how does the eye encode information from the external environment and create it into vision. So, that was what we did up till now in the past 4 lectures. Once the information is passed on from the sensory organ and is coded through the biological mechanisms, a meaning has to be generated out of it, and that is where the idea of perception comes in. Perception is making meaning out of sensory stimuluses or making meaning out of information which is passed on from the sensory stimuluses. So, organization of those sensory stimuluses into meaningful bits is what is perception. Before we start perception, let me tell you a little story for why do we need to study perception first of all. So, there is this famous case where these two hunters were actually venturing into wild life, and they were spending the night there. So, it was night and they had their camp made out, and they were enjoying the night, and they were looking for bears which they can shoot. And so, it was nearly dusk, not actually night, nearly dusk, and so in that point of time they were talking to each other. They were partially intoxicated, and they heard a shrill noise. When they heard a shrill noise, and at this point of time they were very far away from their camp. So, when they heard the shrill noise, one of the hunters, actually both of the hunters, picked up their gun and they shot in the direction of the shrill noise. They thought it was a bear which was actually mourning, and the idea was to shoot this bear. As soon as they shot from their gun a bullet, they heard a shrill human noise, a shrill human cry for help. They rushed to that direction from where the tent was and where they actually shot, in the direction in which they shot. And when they actually went near the tent, they saw that another hunter, which was in the nearby neighborhood, was actually shot by the bullet. How can that be possible? They did see a bear. In the low light of the dusk, what they saw was a bear which was approaching and grilling and making terrible sounds. So, they shot. So, the question was, both of these people were then tried for murder, and when the case went into the court, what happened is that all evidences were collected. Now, as an evidence, it was found out that both the shots actually passed the tent, but one of the shots hit the person and the other shot cleanly passed through the tent. The question was, how can these people imagine a yellow tent to be a bear? It was very difficult to explain this, that how can it be possible that this people who know their tent very well, they were away from the tent, but in the light of the dusk, how can they imagine the tent to be a bear? The jury did not believe it, and one of the person was convicted. Years later, it was explained how the perceptual system can actually fool us. So, with the light intensity decreasing and with the level of intoxication that they have, it was fairly possible to see the tent as a bear and they hitting the tent or they trying to save their life with the gun. And so, years later, these kind of explanations were provided, and the person who actually had spent some years in jail, he was given some relief, or he was let go of the jail. This is what perception is all about. This is what perception is. At times, you actually see things that do not exist. You make meaning of things that do not exist. But why are all these errors, and how these all errors actually begin? So, before we begin with this perception chapter, I will show you some illusions. I will show you some slides here, and I will maybe give you some time to see what you see, and I will show to you that what you see with your eyes is not what is presented to you, and that is what perception is all about, and then I will explain how does the perception process work. So, ready for it? Let us go. So, as you can see, this is a funny picture. Here is a cat and here is a mirror, and when the cat sees the mirror, sees a tiger. This is what perception is all about. As you can see the headline, what it says is the process of organizing and interpreting information which enables us to recognize meaningful objects is what the event is. So, although the cat actually in the mirror is the cat, but what the cat is perceiving is that it is a tiger, and this is what perception is all about. So powerful is the idea of perception. Let us see something else. This is called the Herman grid. Now, we have seen this grid in the last lecture on sensation. So, what I ask you to do is to move from this direction and this direction onwards, your eyes. As you do that, you will see that in between this area, at this area you will see graying out, which means that you no more see a white color, but you see smudges of gray color. Why is that happening? Remember the explanation that I gave you in the chapter on sensation, and there I said why this happens is because how the cones and rods are actually located on your retina, and that is one reason why when you quickly move from this area to this area, you see the smudges. Let us go to a third figure. Now, obviously this is the best figure to look at, and when you do that, once you focus on this figure, you see that things are moving, and believe me, they are not. So, the idea of motion that happens here is because it is an illusion, and if you try focusing yourself at the center of these, so this is the center where you try focusing yourself for longer periods of time, what will happen is the motion disappears. So, the motion happens because there is a stimulus is presented in such a way that it creates virtual motion on you, and see, that is the power of perception, that things that do not exist actually start existing. It is not only with figures that perception can happen, it can happen with a lot of things. Now, this is an interesting thing to look at. Focus your eyes in the middle plus. If you do that, after a period of time, what you will see is you will not see these moving violet figures, but you will see a single green figure which is moving. Can you do that? I am pretty sure most of you would be seeing that, and then this is alternating. So, sometimes you see the green figure, a single green ball which is moving, and then at other times you see the violet ball which is moving. That is the power of what perception can do. Let us look at this. What do you see? And most people are going to tell me that what they see are two triangles one over the other. There is a black triangle and on top of the black triangle is a white triangle. Correct? Wrong. These are not two triangles. What I see is three angles in black and three balls which have a section cut off of it and placed in the right direction, and that is why there is this imaginary triangle in white that you see, and then you believe that this white triangle is actually covering the black triangle. Isn't that what is happening? But then if you look into it, the perceptual system is making meaning of it when there is no meaning to start with. It is not only with figures that you actually see these illusions or perceptual illusions happen or perceptual inconformity happens. There are other written things or written documents where you see perception. Let us look at this and try to read it. Simple, a bird in the hand. Now, what most people miss is there are two the. If you look into it, there is one here and there is other here, and it is very conveniently that people miss one the, and the organization or the reading is so the ability of reading is so developed in humans that you do not see one of these until and unless I point it out to you. Interesting one and the best one. Look at this. It is a good example of a brain study. Now, if you can read this, you have a strong mind, and most of us can. Here you cannot read, here you cannot read, here you cannot read until you come to this thing. Now, it is proof how your mind can do amazing things, impressive things. In the beginning it was hard, but now on this line your mind is reading it automatically with our even thinking about, without thinking about. So, without thinking about it, because be proud only because certain people can only read this. Please forward if you can read this. Amazing, right? Now, if you look into it, there is nothing, there is nowhere where you can find sentences, but you can read it. Amazing, isn't it? And that is what perception can do. So, let us start our idea of what perception is and how does it really function. What is the way in which perception functions? So, before we go into the idea of perception or the 5 functions of perception, let me tell you what is the need of perception at all. What is the need of making meaning of stimuluses which actually come to us? Now, if I was a small flower, if I was a daffodil, the only thing that I wanted from life was to know where my roots are going, where my leaves are going, how big it is, where are the nutrients in, where is the water, and those kind of questions which are there. And so, these are pretty simple questions. So, if I was a flower or if I was a bird, these are the questions that I actually need. But most human beings are not birds and they are complex in nature, and that most of us will agree. And so, for that matter, human beings, since they are complex in nature, they have 4 or 5 functions, or at least 4 functions that I can think of, which is different from most simple organisms. And so, what are these 4 functions? One of these functions is that human beings are mobile, they move. Now, human beings can locomote, right, but flowers cannot, and since they can locomote, they have to navigate through places and directions and cities and all kind of things, environments. Once they are required to do that, perceptual systems are required, because this perceptual system will tell them where to go and where not to go. If these systems are not present, then human beings will keep on falling down, keep on running into obstacles, and will never be able to pass on or never be able to navigate directions. So, one of the primary functions of human beings, which is different from birds or animals or plants or flowers, is that they can move. The second function is that human beings manipulate. Now, human beings manipulate symbols to make meaning. For example, when you are at any point of time when you are reading something, you are doing something, there are lots of symbols around us. There are symbols of currency, there are symbols of attention, which or the symbols of direction, there are symbols of things like several things. If you look around the world, there are lots of symbols, and at any point of time we look at these symbols and they make meaning to us. So, human beings, they make meaning of symbols and interpret these, and then they go around their everyday work. Now, in terms of manipulation, human beings also manipulate objects around them. For example, if you are sitting in a car, you manipulate the wheel. If you are walking, you manipulate your leg. If you are riding a bicycle, you manipulate something else. And so, human beings do a lot of manipulation. So, not only human beings are mobile, they also manipulate at different functions, and human beings also use symbols and make decisions based on the symbols. For example, if there is a red light, it is a symbol that do not cross. If it is a green light, there is a symbol that you cross. If it is an orange light, it gives you invitation to pass till the point of time that it turns into or pass slowly. There are symbols in driving, there are symbols everywhere. And so, the third function that human beings are prone to is understanding symbols and make meaning out of it. And the fourth thing is that human beings execute plans. Human beings, based on their capacities, they execute a number of plans. They make complex plans, and not only they make complex plans, they execute it. So, for example, cooking dinner tonight. Now, for that I have to make a plan of getting something from the market, then how do we make it, what temperature should the oven be, where I should be putting it, where should be hot, should be cold, how many people to call, not to call, that kind of a thing. And so, human beings actually make plan, and so that is one of the 4 functions that human beings do, and because of that they are different from smaller organisms. And for all these functions to actually go through, for all these functions to take place, it is believed, there are 2 group of scientists which believe that the information from sensation is more than enough. Now, on one level we have someone called J. Gibson. So, before we come to the 5 functions, there is the need to explain why these 5 functions, how these 5 functions come about. So, we have 2 classes of theories which believe why perception is necessary, or how perception really functions, what is necessary. So, the one theory is called the Gibsonian theory, and what Gibsonian theory actually tells is that the light which is following onto the retina has enough information, and this 2D structure, this 2D information on the retina is more than enough for human beings to do whatever they want to do, to achieve whatever they want to achieve. Now, this theory is called the theory of ecological optics, and the theory of ecological optics says that the retina, the light falling on the retina has enough information, and that is how they believe that pilots actually make decisions of landing, turning around and things like that. So, you do not need to use your brain, the information which is coming onto the retina from the sensory organs, that is enough for making all kind of manipulations, making plans, doing decisions and so on and so forth. Opposition to that are a group of psychologists who says that no, it is more than enough. It is not more than enough. Human beings at all point of time need an updated image of the world around them, or a model of the environment, an updated model of the environment. So, human beings are not only dependent on static information which is falling on the eye, they need an updated information of the environment around us, or for them to create a model of the environment, and based on this model they do what they do. They make meaning of the world around us, and that makes them do primary functions. So, what does this theory actually say? This theory says that, so it is called the updated, it is not actually called the updated information, but I will state it as the update environment theory. And so, what this theory says is that human beings need 2 information for an updated view of the environment around us. First is information from sensory organs. So, human beings, for creating a model of the environment around us, a model which is being updated at all points of time, need 2 bits of information. The first information is information which is coming from the sensation. So, Gibsonian view or the Gibsonian idea. So, all information which is coming from the physical environment falling onto the sensory organs is what human beings need. Other than that, they also need certain assumptions. So, for perception to function, human beings not only need information from sensations, they also need certain assumptions. Assumptions like birds fly, assumptions like lizards are mostly on the roof, Assumptions like the roof is always on the top, assumptions like a door will mostly open on the outside, these kind of assumptions. So, certain assumptions that fishes will always swim in water, and these kind of assumptions are necessary for human beings to make perceptions, because if fishes can fly, then the whole world around us will be haywire. And so, based on these assumptions and based on certain informations which is coming from sensations, human beings integrate these two things and create predictions, and these predictions actually are what are called perceptions. So, how do human beings perceive? Human beings mostly perceive not from just sensations, but certain assumptions about the world and integrate these two together to form perception. So, what is perception then? Perception is integrating sensory information from the world with certain assumptions or beliefs that, or certain pre-encoded beliefs that human beings have, combine them together to make meaning of the incoming stimulus in relation to the world around you. That is what perception is all about. Now, most perception generally fall into 5 categories, and what we are going to do in this lecture and the upcoming lecture is we are going to focus ourselves onto these 5 categories or onto these 5 functions of perception. So, let us start looking at it. So, there are 5 functions of perception. For any perception to go through, we have 5 things, right. So, perception require 5 steps, or it is a 5-step model. First, the first step in perception, or the first thing that should happen, first event in a perceptual event is called attention. So, attention is used to make decisions about which incoming information is to be further processed and which is not. At any point of time, your eye is receiving a lot of information from the world. Dependent on your attention or attentional span, we decide what information to look at and what information not to look at. If we try taking in all the information inside us, or if we try encoding all the information inside us from the sensory system, then it will not make meaning. For example, if I am driving a car, the information that I want is only looking at looking at the road. I do not want the information from the car radio which is coming up, or from the friend who is talking next to you, or the person next to you in another car who is honking, or any other, or how the wind is blowing. Those kind of information is not immediate, but when the car is moving smoothly, then I can perhaps take some of these information. So, there are certain information that I do not want and certain information that I want, and perception is basically deciding which information to process. So, making decisions about which incoming information is important to us. The second step in perception is the system must be able to determine where the objects are located in the external environment. The second step in perception is finding out what objects you are looking at and where these objects in the environment. Once you can find out where these objects in the environment, once you are able to locate these objects in the environment, you can perhaps separate the background from the foreground, and then you can do a perceptual process, or you can do perception or make meaning out of it. If you are not able to separate the background from the foreground or the figure from the ground, you will not be able to make meaning of what you are seeing and what you are not seeing, what you have to see and what you do not have to see. The third system of perception is the perceptual system may be able to determine which objects are out there in the environment. Not only we should be able to, and this is called recognition. This is called recognition. So, I should be able to recognize what I am seeing, I should be able to localize or locate what objects are there, and I should be able to attend. So, perception starts with attention, then localization, and then recognition. Recognition is the process through which we are able to distinguish objects in the environment. So, what is a tree, what is a cow, what is a person, and so on and so forth. If you cannot do that, what will happen is everything seems to be the same. So, that is the third step in perception. The fourth step in perception is that, as I said, perception starts with not only getting information about the environment and updating them, it also works in terms of certain assumptions. We have to have used certain assumptions, and these are the last two things to do. The system must be able to abstract the criteria features of a recognized object. What is meaning abstraction? So, this is called abstraction. So, when I see a particular object in the environment, I should be able to gather only those features of the object in the environment which I require. Now, what is the meaning of this? Anything that you see in the environment, so you perceive every day, right? So, if you are looking at a chair, now there is a model of the chair in the head, that chair should be looking like this, and that is called the prototype. We will come to that when we explain the idea of perception. So, the prototype is an idea of a chair which is in your head or which is stored somewhere as a representation in your brain. Now, once you see a chair, what features do you want to take from it is just the idea of its form and the idea of the fact that it is a chair. And when these ideas or these information gets binded up or gets thrown onto the brain, which does a comparison, and based on what you are seeing in terms of angles, lines and things like that, it makes an assumptions, and also affordances, it makes an assumptions that this is a chair. So, every time you see a chair, you actually do not perceive the whole chair, you perceive parts of it, right. For example, there is a bean bag, how do you make an idea that it is a chair? What is the function of a chair? What is the idea of a chair? A chair is something in which you sit. So, it has to have a place where you can sit, and if the bean bag has a place where you can sit, which is called the affordance. So, affordance is what does the object afford, or what does the object naturally seem to be like. Now, in a bean bag, there is enough space where a person can sit, and that makes you believe that it is a chair or a kind of a chair. And so, this is called abstraction. Abstraction is basically looking at the external stimulus and making a very primitive model or making the very minimalistic model of what are the features or what are the primary features, what are the extra features which do not exist in the prototype in your head. And the last is, the perceptual system must maintain certain inherent features of the object, and this is what these two things are, what are called assumptions. So, this is called constancy. So, what is constancy? Constancy is maintaining certain features. For example, if there is a door and I move the door out, it still looks like a door. If I move the door in, it still looks like a door, but the angle that it is pertaining, the angle that the door is obtaining is different on your retina, but you still see a door. Look at your friend, if he is coming from a distance and if he is standing in front of your distance, the image that falls in your retina of the friend are different, but then in your mind you do not see your friend actually growing in size and decreasing in size. This is called constancy, right. You see the moon, a full moon is bigger than a part moon, and when you look at them, you do not see that the moon has changed its shape. This is called constancy. So, maintaining that assumption that moons are the top and this kind of idea is what is called constancy. So, let us go back and start with the first function of perception, which is called attention, and let us look at how does attention really function. So, the first step of perception where we start is called attention. Now, what is attention? First of all, attention is a mental filter, a filter which is in your brain, which the brain puts in front of the incoming stimuli, so that certain stimuli can be selected and certain stimuli cannot be selected. Now, think of it as a sieve. Now, what is a sieve? Have you made tea before? Now, if you made tea before, you use a sieve, a filter for separating the tea and the tea leaves. Attention, think of attention as a thing like that. It separates what you want and what you do not want. So, those stimuli which you want or those information from the external stimulus that you want is separated by the attentional filter, and those stimuli you do not want stay on the output or the output side of a filter. So, attention can be thought of as a filter. So, it is a filter like this, and so all incoming information is falling on this attentional filter, and this attentional filter based on certain assumptions or based on certain motivations will allow only. So, if we have R1, R2, R3, R4, these are the 4 input stimuluses which are coming in. The attentional filter based on certain characteristics, certain parameters or certain requirements will only allow R3, because R3 is the information that you want, or R3 is the only stimulus that you want to see. So, the study of attention concerns primarily with the cognitive resources and their limitations. What is attention? So, basically as I said, this is an attentional filter, and this attentional filter depends upon your cognitive resources. How much cognitive resources are there and limitations. The eye has certain limitations, the nose has certain limitations, the ear has certain limitations, it can take only certain amount of information. Now, if you remember sensation, I showed you some limitations. For example, the opponent process theory says that if you see red color, immediately you will see the green color, right. And so, it has the limitation that if I overexcite the red color, then After a point of time it becomes saturated and you start seeing green. So, this is the limitation of the cone for that matter, and so there are certain limitations with the ear also, there are certain limitations with all of the sensory organs, and so these sensory organs, these limitations and the availability of cognitive resources decide which stimulus goes in and which stimulus does not go in, and that is what attention is all about. Now, at any given period of time, people only have a certain amount of mental energy to be devoted to all possible tasks and all the incoming information confronting them. So, what attention filter is? Attention filter is how much mental resource or how much cognitive resource is available with you. The cognitive resources that people have, they get divided or they are used up by the brain for certain functions. Now, most of the cognitive resources are used for doing automatic functions. For example, maintaining heartbeat, maintaining pulse rate, you are not asked, the body does it on their own. Things like perceiving, things like movement, things like thinking, they require cognitive resources as well. So, mostly 70 to 80% cognitive resources is dedicated to doing normal functions or functions which can keep the body alive. The 30% or 20% which is available is what is available to people, and that is what they have to tap to. You have often heard the term saying that we never use 100% of the brain. We only use 5% of the brain. The reason being that, or 10% of the brain, the reason being that the 90% that is there is used for maintaining the bodily functions. And so, within the 10% or 5% which is available, there are a lot of functions to be done. For example, walking, thinking, talking, eating, and so many other things which are there, right. And so, once those are there, only a part of the cognitive resources is left for attention to happen. So, what is attention? Attention is sometimes synonymously used with something called mental concentration. Remember all those days when we were sitting in a class and the teacher used to say, pay attention. What does it mean? It means to concentrate, to focus on what you are doing, and once you focus on what you are doing, you put all your mental energy into one work, and when you do that, all of the stimuli which is in front of you, which is next to you, does not get perceived or does not get recorded at all, right. So, does not get inputted at all, and that is what is mental concentration. Now, I have a wonderful question here which says, does people concentration level changes with practice? And what I will do is, at the end of this lecture maybe or this topic, I will tell you whether this happens or not. But let us leave this question with you, what do you think? And so, once you are viewing this lecture, what I will do is, there is a forum which you can go to, and maybe you post answers saying that what do you think this happens, whether you can increase your concentration levels with practice. So, let us leave that question open for now. So, attention itself is of two types. You have something called selective attention and you have something called sustained attention. Mostly we deal with something called selective attention. What is selective attention? Selective attention is a process in which you focus your attention selectively to certain stimuli and not to other stimuli. Sustained attention is a process in which you put your attention for longer periods of time on selected stimuli. So, selective is when selectively you look at certain things and then you keep on moving that way. Sustained attention is putting yourself onto one piece of information or one piece of incoming information and staying there for longer periods of time. So, what is selective attention? The term selective attention refers to the fact that we usually focus out attention on one or few tasks or events rather than many. So, selective attention is the term which basically tells that what we tend to do is we focus our attention on some task and not on all tasks. We mentally focus our resources implies that we shut out or at least process less information from other competing tasks. As attention researcher Hal Pressure puts it, what is attention? He says that at any given moment, people's awareness encompasses only a tiny portion of the stimulus impinging on their sensory system. So, what is this attention? So, the first step in perception is attention, which means that I have to narrow down on what to look at and what not to look at. So, once I want to do perception or once I am doing perception, since we are talking about visual perception here, there are other kinds of perception only, but the model that I am using here is called, so this is called visual, this section or lecture is basically on visual perception, because the most easiest to explain is visual perception. So, in terms of visual perception, the eye focusing itself on certain objects in the external environment and not the other objects is what is called perception. Good example. Now, look at these dogs and cats, and can you tell me which of these dogs is possible and which of these cats is possible? The task that you do in searching it is called selective attention. So, selectively you look at this. So, there are a number of dogs and cats, and then what your job is to is tell me which of the dog is possible and which of the cat is possible. Can you do that? And when you do that, what you are actually using is called selective attention. And if you say that this is the proper dog and this is the proper cat that can exist, you are right. The job that you just did is what is selective attention. You focus selectively on all these cats and dogs and compared it with mental representations of what a dog could be and what a cat could be. And so this is not possible, this is not possible, this is not possible, this is not possible, but this is possible. And so how did you do that? Well, you took these objects or you took these forms and compared it to some mental representations which is already there in your head, and that says that this is the only dog and cat possible, or forms of dogs and cats which are possible. So how do we actually read? Visual perception in terms of reading, that is for object perception. So in terms of cats and dogs, what we did was this is object perception, but when we are reading, how does attention process really work, or how does the eye work for that matter? Now the process of seeing starts with visual scanning in the form of fixations, which are brief periods during which the eyes are relatively stationary, separated by saccades, which are quick jumps of the eye from one place to another. So how do we see? The way in which we see is that the eye focuses on certain objects, stays there for a period of time and then jumps to the second object. Now the staying period is very brief and it is called fixation, and the jumping period is also very brief, which is called the saccade. So if I want to focus on this object, and this object has or this scene has two objects, maybe what the eye does is first focuses itself on this. So your eye will first focus on this, is called the fixation, and then quickly move from here to here, because in between I have nothing, no information is there. And so once it does this jump from here to here, this is called a saccade, and this staying at these two objects is what is called fixations. Now the points on which the eye fixates are not random. The eye just does not fixate on anything or any information which is out there in the environment randomly. It is a calculative process, but rather are the areas of scene that contains the most information. So if I use an eye tracker, and if I give you an object, or if I show you a picture and monitor your eye through an eye tracker, I will see that the eye keeps on moving from one point to another point in a particular fashion, in a particular pre-calculated fashion. And how does it do that? It does that in a manner that it focuses itself on objects of maximum information and not focus on areas where there is no information. Now experiments to verify this started by showing scenes of a farmyard with either a tractor and an octopus in the middle. It was found out that the eye fixations were directed earlier and more frequently to the unusual object tractor, right. So an experiment was done in which a scene was created, a farmyard scene was created. In this farmyard you had a tractor and an octopus, and so what happens is when I looked at eye fixations in terms of how the eye is moving, we saw that unusual objects required lesser attention than usual objects, right. Usual objects got little attention. Now this is a good demonstration of how the eye actually looks at. If you look at this figure, now this figure has certain points which has to be followed. For example, this is the one face, an object, and person, a person, an object here and something here, and that is what it is, and all these are blanks. Now what does the eye do? This is an eye tracker. This is the demonstration or the data from an eye tracker. If you look into it, the fixations are at the point of most region which I have circled out. If you look here, still it is the same way. Now these regions which have no data at all, you see that no fixations are here. For most of it, the maximum fixations are here. If you look into it, and in this case also the maximum fixations are here, and this is where my faces are. Or if you look into it, this is where my this is the region which has the most number of fixations, which means that our theory is correct in terms of the fact that the eye fixates itself onto areas of maximum information and then it moves on, and this is the kind of movement, or this is an eye tracking data. So this is an eye tracking data. Now one of these data is from my own lab, but other data is from some other labs, and so they show how the eye actually moves or make information. There is another kind of attention which is called divided attention without eye movements. Now humans can also selectively attend to some visual stimulus without moving their eye. In experiments that demonstrate this, observers had to detect when an object occurs. On each trial, the person stares at a blank field and then sees a brief cue. A cue is basically a plus sign appearing, or some kind of a stimulus appearing, or some kind of a information appearing, which is directing stimulus, such as small arrow that directs the subject's attention whether to the left or to the right. An object is then presented either in a location indicated by the cue or the opposite location. The interval between the cue and the object is too brief for observers to move their eyes, yet they can detect the object faster in the cued location than when in the occurs in elsewhere, which basically means that if I create a stimulus like this, or if I create an experiment like this, in this what happens is the subjects are asked to first look at the center of the screen, which has a plus sign. Later on what will happen is certain objects will appear, right. So, maybe the object is a bell, or an object is a dog, or so on and so forth. Maybe this is a dog, and so it has a tail, this is the mouth, and so on and so forth. So, these objects will appear. Now, what will happen is there are two conditions. In one condition, what will happen is after seeing the plus, you may see a star here, and as soon as you see the star here, the object, in this case the bell, appears here. This is case number 1. In case number 2, what will happen is you see a star here, but the bell appears somewhere here. Now, if an experiment like this is done, so you start with a plus sign, then a cue appears, and in terms of the cue, in one case the cue, where the cue appears or where this signal appears, you see the object there, or sometimes you see it opposite. Now, experiments reveal that when the cue was presented, the object that you want to see or you see is presented in terms of where the cue is appearing, people responded it faster, and then when it was in opposite direction, which basically means that they did have divided attention. So, they did see this object on the opposite direction, but the response time was slower, which means that people can see multiple objects, or they have something called divided attention. So, this was about the first step, that is called attention, in which we focus ourselves onto certain objects and how do we read certain objects. The second step, as we saw, is which object, where in the external environment is the object, and this term is called localization. So, what is localization? Localization of information in the external environment is essential for solving the following problems. Why do we need localization? As I said, the second step in perception is localization, which means how do we know what objects are there, and not what objects are there, rather that is the third step. The second step is where are the objects in the external environment. First step is recognizing that or basically filtering what you want to see, and the second step is locating where in the external environment are these objects. So, why do we need localization? The answer is navigating our view through the event cluttered environment. We need this localization because human beings navigate through cluttered environments, and if they can locate objects in the external environment, they can pass through complex environments, or they can navigate through complex environments and do their day to day work. So, localization is an important part because localization helps human beings move in complex environments, do complex things in environments by the information which is provided the sense organs, and using this information and certain assumptions to find out what is there in the external environment and where they are in related to where this person is. Think of it in terms of the map. When you see a map, you can see things around you, and once you do that, you are able to navigate it. So, localization is important because it helps in navigating people. Also, grasping objects. Navigation is important, or localization is important because it helps you in grasping objects or touching objects. If there is an object in front of you and if you cannot see where it is, you will be fumbling around. So, when you want to grasp certain objects, or when you want to reach certain objects, hold them in hand, reach to them, or in any interaction with an external object, the thing that you require is called localization. So, what is localization? It is achieved by first separating the objects from one another and then separating each from the background. So, there are two steps in localization. First, separate objects among themselves. So, if there are two objects, if I have a scene like this, and in this I have a person and a dog, the first step This is my dog. It's not very good drawing, but then you have to bear with me. So, if I have a person and dog in a external environment, the first step in localization is separating the person from the environment. So, the first step is I have a man and a dog, and the next step is looking at these forms and separating it from the environment, which is, or the background, which is this frame. So, this first step is recognizing that there are two objects. The second step is recognizing the two objects is on a white frame or is on a white object. That is the two steps which are there. So, how does the separation of objects happen? It happens in terms of figure and background. So, what is this figure and background separation? Now, the most elementary form of perceptual organization is that in a stimulus with two or more distinct regions, we usually see part of it as figure and part of it as background. Now, if I have an object like this, right, and so again if I have this dog, right, so these are the legs of the dog and this is the tail, this is the mouth and eyes. So, if I have a dog like this, the idea of what is a dog and what is not is that anything inside this, the colored area, is what is the dog, and whatever is white is not a dog. And this separation is important because the outline which is filled in green is what the dog is, and whatever is in white is not the dog. So, this separation is important, and this is called separating the figure from the background. So, once we do that, anything which is green filled in it is called the dog. So, this line, this dark line that I have drawn, green color, is what is the dog, and anything outside of it is called the background. So, this is my figure and this is what is called the background. This is how separation of objects are done. Now, the region seen as figure contains the object of interest. The figure contains the object of interest which appears more solid than the ground and appears in front of it. So, this dog appears in front of the white surface, and that is why it is called the figure and the white surface is called the background. The ground is the region that appears to be behind the figure. So, this is the ground, it is behind this dog, and that is why it is called the background. Figure background relationships. Look at this. What do you see? Now, it is called a reversible image and it is very easy to see. Now, if you consider the black as the background, the moment you think the black is the background, which means that this figure, if I draw like this, is a cutout, and once that is there, this figure is a cutout. You see two people staring at each other. Can you see the two people staring at each other? These are the nose, this is the mouth, and this is what is all about. But the moment we see the white as the background and black as the figure, you see a vase. So, this is basically, if black is the background, you see two faces, and if white is the background, you see a vase. This is called a reversible image. Can you see the vase and the two faces which are seeing each other? Yes, that is what is perception all about, and that is called localization or separating the figure from the background. Let us look a second one. Look at this. What do you see? Again, keeping the black as the background or white as the background, there are two figures. If we keep black as the background, foreground sorry, and white as the background, you see a person who is actually playing a saxophone. Can you see the person? This is the nose, this is the form of the body, and this is my saxophone which is there. But if I change, so if I make white as the background, I see a person playing a saxophone, correct? But if the moment I say black is the background, I see a woman, a face of a woman. Can you see the face of a woman? These are the two eyes, this is the nose, this is the mouth, this is a part of her hair, and so on and so forth. Amazing, right? Reversible figures. So, this is important. The first step in localization, or maybe the second step in localization, is distinguishing what is the figure and the background, and that tells you a lot about how to do perception or localizations, and this is important for perception. Now, there are certain rules which are followed in this perception, or there are certain perceptual organizations which are proposed by Gestalt rule, which is used for perception or which is used for localization of object in the background. Now, Gestalt psychologists focused on how we group objects together, because perception or this localization requires not only separating objects from one another, but also organizing objects together so that we can view them. So, we innately look at things in groups and not as isolated elements. There are certain rules which the Gestalt have, and these rules are used for perception. Now, one of the rule is called proximity. This groups objects that are closer together as being part of the same group. The second rule is called similarity, which says that objects which are similar in appearance are perceived as being part of the same group. Similarly, we have the third rule which says that objects that form a continuous form are perceived as the same group, and we also have a fourth one which is called closure. Like top down processing, we fill gaps in it and can recognize it. Now, immediately it will come to your mind that one of the figures that I showed to you, the two triangles, actually follow the rule of closure, and that is why you see the two triangle. Let us look at what does it really mean. This is proximity. So, when I show you this, what do you say? I see bunch of lines, parallel lines. All of these lines are independent of each other, but you group them together, and this is called proximity rule. When I ask you what is this, you see that you say that I have two group of triangles and one group of circle, and this is called the idea of similarity. Similarly, when I show you this, most people will say that it is a curve, a complex function curve. It is not a sine curve, but it is a cosine curve. And when you say that, it is wrong, because what will happen is this part is different from this part, but since they are aligned in a certain manner, it looks at continuity, or it appears to be continuous. Similarly, when I show you this, what do you see? You see 3 balls or 3 dumbbells, but they are not 3 dumbbells, these are 6 different balls which are connected by sticks. So, the idea of grouping them together is what is Gestaltist. What Gestaltists say is how we make perception, or how do we do localization. That was of how perceiving objects or grouping objects was. But then an amazing thing with the eye is that the eye can not only see 2-dimensional, it can 3-dimensional. So, how does the eye see the third dimension? How does the eye perceive the third dimension or the 3D pictures? So, perceiving distance require depth cues, different kind of visual information that logically or mathematically provide information about some objects on depth. When you see the structure of the eye, I said that an object which is in the field will actually be projected onto the retina in a reverse manner, but the object will be in 2D format, right, because the retina has only 2 dimensions, a length and a breadth. A retina has a length and a breadth. How does it create 3D? It creates 3D by doing some mathematical and logical calculations. So, how does the 3D actually come about? There are 2 different kind of cues. Have you ever wondered why do we have only 2 eyes, or why do we have 2 eyes? The reason that we have 2 eyes is that the 2 eyes are helpful in making distance, right. So, once you want to see distance, once you want to calculate distance, one of the cues or one of the things is that a single eye can see distance which is far away. So, there are certain monocular cues, which means that these cues are independent, and any of the eye can actually see it, right. And so, how do you see distance? You see distance by certain cues or certain information which each eye can actually process, or which and these cues are actually assumptions. So, eyes have the certain eyes or independent, both the eyes have independent assumptions. Based on these certain assumptions and fitting these assumptions onto an object which is falling, or the information from an object which is falling onto your eye, the brain calculates distance. How does it do that? One of the cues or one of the assumptions is the relative size. What does it mean? If an image contains an array of stimuli objects that differ in size, the viewer interprets the smaller object as being further away, right. So, if there are 2 objects there, and so 2 lampposts, and if these lampposts are in this way, that one lamppost looks smaller than the other lamppost, people believe or assume that lampposts are of the same size, and that is why they say that the lamppost behind the smaller lamppost is further away than the lamppost which is in front of you. Similarly, something called interposition is another assumption. If an object is positioned so that it obstructs the view of other object, the viewer perceives the overlapping object as being nearer to you. So, if there are 2 objects which are in front of each other and one blocks the view of the other, the one that blocks the view is perceived to be nearer to you than the one or object of the view of which is being blocked. Similarly, you have something called relative height. Now, among similar objects, those that appear closer to the horizon are perceived to be further away. So, there are diagonal lines inside an object, and these diagonal lines, when it goes inside an object, that creates a motion of depth, that creates a motion of that depth, and within that you have if you have two objects and one object appear to be going inside and the other object appears to be coming out of the frame, then the relative height tells you that there is depth or there is some kind of 3D in the object or depth in the object. There is something called perspective. What is perspective? When a parallel lines in a scene appear to be converging in the image, these are positioned as vanishing, or these are positioned as vanishing, they appear to be perceived as vanishing in the distance, and that creates some kind of an image. And lastly, we have something called shadowing and shading. Now, the configuration if shading and shadows provide information about an object and its depth. So, let us look at those things that we saw right now. So, if this is an object, this is a visual image that we have, and you can see the 4 cues or 5 cues that we have defined. If relative size, so 2 lamp posts, one here and one here, now they are the same size, this appears to be going inside and this is called relative size, that tells you depth. This image actually tells you a depth, right? It looks like a market, and so within the marketplace there are people. This is called interposition. There are two objects, and so this line here drawn in front of this says that this object is in front of it. Similarly, you have perspective. Now, these lines, parallel lines, appear to go inside, right, and converge at some point of time, and that tells you that it has depth. And similarly, shading and shadow, if you look into it, there are shadows falling in a certain manner, and those shadows actually tell you that there is depth and that this object is a 3D object. So, perceiving distance requires depth cues, different kind of visual information that logically or mathematically provide information about some object depths. Now, how does the depth cue really work? An experiment was done by someone called Gibson, and what her idea was that depth perception or perception of depth actually is embedded in humans to start with, and she created something called a visual cliff experiment. What was it? If you are old enough to crawl, you are old enough to see depth. That is the outline of this experiment. Now, we see depth by using two cues that researchers have put into categories. One is called the monocular cue and the other is called the binocular cue. So, we will discuss the binocular movement. So, what Gibson's idea was, or she designed an experiment which is called the visual cliff experiment. What was the experiment? A small baby like this was put on a visual cliff. Now, this is a hypothetical visual cliff. It is an illusion and there is no depth. You can see this is a depth, but this is not a depth, and so the child was put on a area like this, and the child was crawling. Now, it was seen that when the child came near the edge and this edge seems like it is going to fall, the child stopped moving, which basically means that the child didn't crawl out of here because he can perceive depth, he can see that I will fall, and that is called the visual cliff experiment. So, you see that this is where the cliff is and this is the edge of the cliff, the child is not moving further. Now, this is an illusion that has been done, this part is an illusion which seems like a depth, but it is not, and so the child exactly does not move out or does not come back or does not fall. Now, with the monocular cue, so when you are seeing distance, one eye is enough. But when you are seeing nearby objects which are coming right at you, you need something called binocular cues. A very good experiment to understand binocular cues is hold your hand in front of your eyes and then close one eye. If you close the left eye first and then afterwards close the right eye, the hand keeps on moving, the finger keeps on moving. So, if I keep my hand like this, keep the then move the right eye, the position is this, but then I move the left eye, it goes somewhere here, and so keeps on moving. This is basically because the two eyes are there and these eyes create motion or create depth effect for objects which is nearby to you, and that is called the binocular cue. So, we need both of our eyes to see these binocular cues or motions of objects or actually objects in front of you. Retinal disparity. The experiment that I showed you is called retinal disparity. If I close one eye and see an object which is near to you, if the object is far away, then it will appear similar whether you close the left eye or the right eye. But if an object is right in front of you and if you close one of the eyes, the object keeps on moving, and that is called retinal disparity. As an object comes from closer to us, the differences in image between our eyes becomes greater. Convergence. As an object comes closer to eyes, our eyes have to come together to keep focus on the object. So, objects which are two eyes are there, because if objects are there in front of you, we need both the eyes, we need images from both the eyes. Also seeing movies, how do we see movies? We need both the eyes, because both the eyes create different perspectives, and these different perspectives are added together to create the 3D movies that you actually see. There are 3 dimensions, or there are multiple cameras which are taking it, and because you have these two eyes and the binocular cues, you get the 3D vision, and conversion is one of the things which are there. So, if you can see this figure which is in front of you and it is moving, when you look at it, the image of this moving in this direction is because of the two eyes. If you had just one eye, we will not be able to see this motion from nearby. As you can see, this person, as this person is seeing that figure, and because of these two eyes which are there and they are converging to each other, you can see this motion which is out there. Now, how do we perceive motion? There are several, the two eyes are responsible for perceiving motion. So, stroboscopic effect or flip book effect. If you take a book, and there are several cartoons in which we take a book and then we move the book in a certain way, or we just move the pages of the book. When we do that, what happens is we create something called artificial motion, and that happens because we have binocular cues or two eyes. The 5 phenomena, what is the 5 phenomena? You see this object moving in a white space, this red object moving is because of the two eyes or the binocular cues from the two eyes. Do you see the motion here? Now, this motion, artificial motion, is being done because the two eyes is creating this artificial motion, or because of the two eyes that is there. Now, there is quite an explanation to why this happens, but since this is an introductory course, I am not going into the basics of how this motion is created. This is called artificial motion. You would have seen villages, or you would have seen certain diagrams or certain lights which actually move in a certain way and creates motion. Not only create motion, it creates letters and all kind of things. So, this motion that you are seeing is because these lights are actually timed in such a way that it creates motion. Autokinetic effect. If people stare at a white spot light in a dark room, it appears to move, right. So, if this is this object, the movement you are seeing, and this is I mean, in this experiment is not possible, but if assume that it is a dark room and this object is static, it will start moving on itself, and that is because of the two eyes that is there. So, what I will do is I will stop my lecture here and start with the third process of recognition in the upcoming lecture. So, very quickly I will try and review what we did in this lecture. In this lecture, we tried to look at what is perception and how does perception really progress, and then we looked at what is the need of perception for that matter, and we gave up enough information, or we gave up enough evidences of why perception is needed at all. From there on, we looked at the 5-step process that perception starts with, and we covered the idea of what is attention and what attention comprises of, and what kind of attentions are there, and what is the process of attention. Then we looked at the process of localization, which is locating an object in the external environment in terms of not only grouping objects together, but in terms of also figure ground effect. In relation to that, or in addition to that, we actually looked at also how does the eye perceive distance, and not only distance, how does the eye manage 3D images when objects are very closer to you. So, we used something called the idea of binocular cues and monocular cues, and how these binocular cues and monocular cues not only perceives distances and also objects near to you, it also perceives motion. How does motion is perceived? So, we will stop our lecture here and then continue on this in the next lecture, where we will take up what is recognition, what is constancy, and what is abstraction, and how they all combine together to form perception. So, from here now it is goodbye.